Gentes, how to set up and play. First thing we'll do is lay out the game board. Next we'll lay out all the different action tiles. Any tile with a blank back is used with all player counts. So we'll place those face up in their corresponding spot. Tiles with that symbol are only used in 3 or 4 player games. Tiles with the 4 dots are only used in 4 player games. And tiles with this back are used in 2 or 4 player games. So I'm going to set this up for a 2 player game. So I'm going to use these tiles and leave the tiles with 3 or 4 players out for this game. Next we'll shuffle and randomly place out the 6 different types of people. You have the scholar, the artisan, the merchant, the soldier, the noble, and the priest. Next we'll lay out the bonus victory point tiles. For the player, once you play 8 cards to your tableau, get 18 total people, or build all 6 of your cities, you'll lay out tiles equal to the player count. The first player to earn the bonus always earns more than all subsequent players. Second, third, or fourth player to get the bonus earns the same. So since this is a 2-player game, I'll just set out enough for 2 players and return these. Next we'll put out the round marker. We're in the setup phase right now. The game is played over 6 rounds, broken into 3 eras. Players will get a marker on the 0 spot of the victory point track, have the 50 and 100 chits nearby for when that gets exceeded, and then randomly determine a start player. Play always proceeds from the start player going clockwise. In a 2-player game, this yellow region is not used, so if you'd like, you can block those out, or just know that only the red and the green regions are in play, just for a 2-player game. Each player is going to start with 20 coins. They're going to have cubes on each of the cube spots that are blocking available actions at the start of the game. Each player will put 1 hourglass on their time track, and they'll have markers that track the number of people, number of each type of the 6 people. They'll also have 6 cities available to them during the game. You're going to sort the cards into the 3 era decks, and then as part of setup, each player is going to draft 2 cards each. So deal 3 cards per player as a starting display. So this is a 2-player game, so I've laid out 6 cards. In reverse player order, each player will select 1 card until they have their starting 2. So the last player will select this one. We're moving in reverse player order, selecting 1 at a time. And then once each of these players have their 2 starting cards, anything that was remaining will get shuffled back into the Era 1 deck. Each player's starting 2 cards are in their hand. There needs to be an action before they can play them to their tableau. After you've shuffled the Era 1 deck, you're going to lay out 1 card for each of the slots in this bottom card tableau. The final part of setup, each player now gets to train 4 starting people. Usually it's based on what they plan to play in their cards. When you train a person, it's just indicated on this track here. So that indicates that I've trained 1 noble, 1 soldier, 1 merchant, and 1 scholar. So maybe that's how this player decides to train their 4 starting people. As this player's starting 4 people to train, they may decide to train 1 noble, 1 priest, and 2 merchants. So you get to train a total of 4 people in any combination. Once all players have trained their starting 4 people, you're ready to start the game. So each round of Gentes is broken into 2 phases. There's the heyday phase, represented by the sun, and the decline phase, represented by the moon. During the heyday phase, players will alternate turns in clockwise order, performing an action. A typical action requires you to pay for the action, you place the action tile on your time track, and then you place any required hourglasses on your time track. So let's see how that works. So for example, if the starting player wanted to take this scribe action, they can take one of these available tiles. Let's say they choose this one. They pay the cost. In this example, they pay 8 immediately. They're going to place this on their time track, and it requires 2 hourglasses. Now they have the option. They can lay out individual hourglasses, or they may decide to save time on the time track this turn and put out a double hourglass. This will partially impair their next turn, but they're sacrificing next round for additional actions this one. And we'll see at the end of the phase, this will actually get flipped to a single tile and stay on the track, whereas all single tiles, single hourglasses, will get removed at the end of the round. So whenever 2 hourglasses are required, it's the player's option to lay out them as single or as a double. Sometimes they really won't have a choice because there might only be 1 action space left. On a player's turn, they're not allowed to pass. A player is out of the round once all of their spots are filled up. And the heyday phase of the round is complete once all players have filled up their time track. So let's go over each of the main actions. The first one is the tax collector. You can see you take coins. There's no action tile, only hourglasses. So this is the tax collector area on the board. You can see there are no action tiles to take, so this can be useful when you may only have 1 spot left on your board. You can take this action, which requires you to place 1 hourglass, and you would get 4 coin from the bank, or you can take this action, which requires 2 hourglasses, and you get 8 coin from the bank. So since I have room, let's say this player decides to take the 2. Again, they can break it up or split it. There's no action tile. They simply would place the hourglasses and get the 8 coins from the bank since they selected this one. The next action that can be chosen is the new starting player. You get coins from taking this, and you become the new start player in the following decline phase. So start player won't change until we get to the decline phase. You'll see there's there's an action tile, but no hourglasses. So this is the start player. So if you decide to take that, you immediately get 2 coin from the bank, but you can see there's no hourglass, so there's no time penalty for taking this. So you would simply just place it on your time track. It does require a spot, and then when we get to the decline phase, this player will either hold on to start player, or if it was in someone else's hands, they'll get to become it. If nobody takes this in a given round, when we get to the decline phase, start player will simply remain the same. The next action is the philosopher action, where it allows you to train new people. And this is one of the first actions where the amount or the cost of the action tile determines the efficiency or the power of the action. This is the philosopher section up here. These are the 2 tiles available, so one of these would have to be chosen to take this action. Each one has a cost associated with it, with 1 hourglass for these specific tiles. Based on how much is paid determines how many training points you get. So let's assume this player takes this tile. This will go on their board with 1 hourglass, and since they've paid 4, they can look at these 2 rows and to determine the efficiency of the action. So these represent the training cubes on your player board. The top row allows for 1 training. So since 4 was paid, this allows me to train 1 of any of these available people. Or I could choose the second row, and since I paid 4, I can do 2 trainings, but I'm limited to only the people in this column to the left. So I could decide to train a scholar and an artisan, or I could train the artisan twice. Whereas if I instead took this tile and paid 8, you can see this gives me the option to train anyone twice. But let's use our example. I paid 4 and I decide to train this one and this one. So I simply mark those on the player board. So this will move up 1, and the scholar moves up 1. And there's the action marker and the time penalty. Now once the decision is made who to train, this will get rearranged. Whatever people were trained will get put into the back of the line. So whoever was furthest to the right gets placed first. So since these two were trained, they're both going to move to the back. This was furthest to the right, so they'll get placed first, and then the scholar, and they'll push everyone down. And that's the new order the next time someone takes this action. One important concept about training your people is that each row, the cubes could never occupy the same spot, nor can they cross. So at any point, if I have 3 noble trained, the highest amount for this resource, the artisan that I could have trained, is 4. They can never bump. Now if I used another training point to train another artisan, it would force this one to go down. So the highest number of trained people for each of the rows is 6. If you were balanced, you would have 3 trained and 3 trained, or you could have 0 trained and 6 trained in this resource, in this person, the noble. If at any time a player has 6 people trained in all 3 of their rows, meaning all of their cubes were touching, so they're at their maximum, it doesn't require the combination. Here's 6 and 0, here's 3 and 3, here's 2 and 4. They would have 18 total trained people, and it would qualify for them to take this bonus victory point tile. The next action is the navigator. This allows a player to build 1 city or hometown and get the rewards of 1 region. This is the navigator section up here. So as usual, you would have to pay the immediate cost of the tile and add those time tokens to your board. And it allows you to build the type of building matching the icon. So here, 0 cost, it requires 3 hourglasses, and it allows you to build a temple. This allows you to build an oracle. This allows you to build a trade house, and these are wilds or jokers. You can build any 3 of the different types. So maybe if another player took this one and this wasn't available and you needed to build a temple, you could use one of the wild cards. But let's use this example. Let's say the player takes this tile, adds it to their board as normal. We see it takes 3 hourglasses. Instead of taking singles, maybe I'll take 1 double and a single. I didn't have to pay anything for it, but now I'm able to take one of my cities and put it on a matching icon. Now I have 2 choices. I can place it in what's called a hometown. So this column for the temple matches my tile, so I can put it in any one of these 3. This will give me access to additional benefits throughout the game. Or I can put it in any city matching the temple tile. So this is the temple, here's the oracle, and here's the trade house. Now I can put it in this green one or this one. Maybe I'll put it in this one. When a city is placed in a region, it's going to trigger all the other cities in the same region, including the one that was just placed. So if it's my first one, I'm only going to trigger this benefit. But if this was later in the game and I was placing here, now it would trigger all of my cities in the same colored region. Only 1 city is allowed per spot, so once a player gets here, no other player can get here. But let's look at all of these different bonuses. This one allows you to take a cube and place it into your temple area. So this is the temple area of your player board. You would simply place one there. This allows you to get immediately 2 victory points on the score track. That bonus is 5 coins immediately from the bank. And this one allows you to get a cube into your oracle. And this is the oracle section of your player board. So those are the 4 different types of bonuses that you'll see in these different region cities. Instead of placing in a region, let's say this player had done this on prior turns, they decide to place in a hometown. It still has to be the matching symbol based on the tile they took. They can choose one region to fully activate. So in this case, they would choose this region to fully activate, and they'd get the bonuses for each of those. So the navigator action allows you to place one of your cities, and then you get the bonuses for one region, either the one you placed it, if you're placing it in a city, or if you put one in a hometown, you get to pick the region to activate. If at any point a player places their 6th city, they're eligible to take the 6 city ones. If they're the first one to do it, they get the larger bonus. All subsequent players would get the smaller bonus. Anytime these tiles are taken, the victory points are scored immediately on the score track. And we'll discuss how to use these hometown bonuses once we've covered all the different actions. The next action is the scribe. This allows you to take new civilization cards. Again, this is one of the actions where the cost of the action is going to determine the efficiency. So the scribe action, you've got to take one of the available tiles, pay the cost and the time, and then you get to take cards based on the value paid. So let's use this example. I pay 6 and add the time marker. This means I can take cards from the tableau. This means I can take cards from the discard stack. Let's cover this one first. So based on how much you paid will dictate how many cards and from where you can take them. So since I paid 6, I kind of match at least what I paid, so I can cover the 5 or the 6 here. If I choose this spot, I can take 3 cards from this spot to the left. So if I really wanted 3 cards, I can get all these. Or here, since I paid 6, I can get 2 cards, but it allows me access to cards further to the right. So if I really wanted this card and something else, I can take it. So I can take up to 2 cards for this spot. Or if there was a particular card that I wanted that was way up over here on the right side, you can see this allows me to take 1 card from this spot all the way to the left. If you pay the maximum value of 10, you can take 2 cards from anywhere on the board. Or here, you could take, if you pay the 10, you can get 3 cards from this spot down. So in this example, let's say I really wanted these 3 cards here to the left. I paid my 6, so I'll take these 3 cards into my hand. There isn't a hand limit per se, but at the end of the decline phase, we do a hand limit check, and for any card over 3, there's a time token penalty. So be mindful of how many cards you have in your hand at any time. Once cards are chosen with this action, all of these cards will slide down to the left and will immediately refill with additional era cards based on the era that we're in. So I've slid the cards to the left, and then I've refilled the right side with new cards. So the next player that comes and takes a tile here has a full selection available to them. In addition to taking from the tableau, a player can instead decide to take one from the discard pile. A discard pile won't be formed until the end of the first era, but at that point, a player, if they paid at least 6, can look through the entire discard pile and select to take 1 card. If they paid at least 10, they can look through the entire discard deck and take 2 cards from it and add it to their hand. The final main action is the Chronicler. This allows the player to play exactly 1 civilization card. So they've got to take one of the available tiles here, pay the cost and the time on their time track, and then they can play 1 card from their hand. So to play the card, the first thing you do is always to check the requirements. The requirements are in this lower left section. Some cards require that the player have already built a building of a certain type. So in this example, a temple is required. If there's no building requirement, it'll be blank up top. You also have to check whether you have the number of required workers. So you would check your population track to see, yes, I've got the 1 merchant and the 2 scholars that are required for this card. So all the requirements have been met, so I can play the card. Next, you're going to score victory points. You're going to score 1 victory point for every symbol, in addition to every matching symbol. So since this is my first card, I'll just score 1 point for one symbol plus the indicated victory points, so I'd immediately get 2 victory points for this card. If this card was played and I had already previously played these cards, I could decide to select a matching symbol. I'm going to select this wavy because it matches more of my cards, so I would get 1, 2, 3 victory points in addition to the 1 on the card. So 4 total victory points from playing this card. In addition, there's other advantages and disadvantages that each card holds, and we'll cover those later. But some will be immediate and get resolved when the card is played. Some will give you persistent benefits throughout the game. Some benefits will only take effect during the decline or the moon phase. There's no limit to the number of cards a player can play to their tableau. They can only ever play 1 with the chronicler action. If at any time a player plays 8 cards to their tableau, they're eligible to collect this bonus tile and score the victory points. But this is a good time to talk about the additional actions in addition to the main actions. The first one are the Oracle and the Temple. At any point, a player can return 3 cubes in any combination from either of those spots to permanently train one person. So they may decide, I've got a lot of cubes in my Temple and my Oracle. Let me discard 2 of these and 1 of these. So 3 in any combination get discarded, but you get to permanently train one player, and it can be any player of your choice. Another action is specifically the Oracle action. You can discard or return 1 of the cubes to exchange people on your population track, and you can do this twice. So if I had a cube on my Oracle, I could discard this, and I get to do 2 exchanges. So for a single exchange, I get to say, I'm going to lose a scholar, but gain a soldier. That's 1 exchange. I've traded 1 person for another. Discarding a cube lets you do it twice. So then I may also decide I'm going to get a noble, but lose an artisan. So it can be any combination, but you get to do 2 exchanges. The final additional action is specifically the Temple action. You can discard or return 1 cube to receive 1 virtual person. And this is used when trying to meet the requirements of a card. So let's say I was taking the action, the chronicler action, to play a card. And let's say this was the one I was trying to play. And let's say I had 0 soldiers. And this one required 2 soldiers. What I could do is for each cube I discard from the Temple, I get a virtual person. So I could discard 2 and say I have 2 soldiers, and I would immediately satisfy this card. If I had 1 soldier already, then obviously I'd only have to discard 1 for a virtual, and then I satisfy this card, which allows me to play it, assuming I obviously had this trade house building also. The cube is permanently discarded. The population track is not affected. So it's not, you don't get to permanently train a new person, you just get a virtual one for the purposes of satisfying the card. Next, let's talk about how these hometown bonuses work. So players with cities in specific rows have access to these additional bonuses. Some will be tiles, virtual tiles that can be played as an action, like these first 2. Some are modifiers when actions are played. This one, this one, this one, and this one. So let's take a look at each one individually. So this one, a player on their turn, let's say all of these tiles were gone, so they had no access to tiles, or let's say they weren't happy with having to pay 10. They could decide instead, I'm going to use this virtual tile. So a tile doesn't need to be placed on their board. They would still have to pay the time token and the cost. They would pay 6 and a time marker, but they get to take that action. They get to take that scribe action now as normal. So they could take one from the tableau, or if they paid 6, you can see that make them eligible to take one from the discard. Whenever a player decides to use the benefits of a city, it can be done once during the heyday phase for each city. They simply mark it with a cube to show that they took that action. And so they can no longer use this city for any benefits in this row. If they have multiple cities, they could, on a subsequent turn or a subsequent impulse during this round, activate this city and use either of these. This one will modify the scribe action. So let's say a player really wanted to take a scribe action. This was the only tile left, so let's say they had to take this one because they already used this one and they want to take more cards. So they take this to their board. What this allows them to do is they can pay any cost, 1 to 10, for taking that tile. They're still required to pay the time penalty, but instead of having to pay the full 10, they may decide, you know what, I'm only going to pay 3 because I just want these 2 cards. I don't need to pay the full amount because I'm only interested in something that I can get with less money. And as we talked about, you'd simply mark it with a cube to indicate that you've used that power. Now these can stack, you can use them at the same time. So during one action, if I have 2 cities up here, I can say I'm going to use the first city to take this action, this tile action, and I'm going to use the second city to modify it so I can pay any cost I want for that scribe action. This next row works the same way. A player could decide, if they have a city in this row, to have access to a virtual philosopher tile that would allow them to do training at a cost of 4 with 1 time penalty, or instead they could decide to use, when I'm taking a normal scribe action, a philosopher action to train people, I want to modify it and allow me to pay any amount of expense I want. So I may decide I'm going to take this tile, which would normally cost me 8. I'm going to mark it to show that I've used it because I don't want to pay 8. I only want to pay 4 because I want to train 2 people. I don't need the higher expense. But always keep in mind I can only use a city once during a heyday phase. So if I had used it prior to maybe take this virtual tile, I couldn't use it again to also get this modifier on a future philosopher action. The final row gives me access to 2 action modifiers. The first one modifies the philosopher action. It allows the player to train an additional person. So they would require them to take one of the tiles. So if they took this one, paid the cost and the time, 8 normally allows them to train any 2 people. If they decide to activate this city and mark it, they could train an additional 1. So they could train 1 in addition to whatever one they take. In this example, they could train 3. Again, these could stack, so a player may decide, you know what, I'm going to take this tile, I'm going to activate this city to modify it so I can pay whatever I want, and I'm going to activate this city so I could train an additional person, all with a single action. The final modifier modifies the tax collector action. So let's say a player had another house there, city there. This allows them to do the tax collection action a second time. So if they came down here and took this action for 1 hourglass to get 4, they could activate this city, put a cube on it, and it allows them to do it a second time. So they would get another 4. They don't have to pay the hourglass again. It's simply they're collecting the money twice. You're going to also see that some of these things also exist on cards. So this card gave this player the same persistent power of getting an additional money collection. So let's say this player had that card. They decide to activate this building because they're taking this action. They pay the 2 hourglass. They get the 8 plus another 8 plus another 8 for the card. So they could get 24 with that single action by modifying it with a city and a card. So as we've shown, these types of virtual tiles and action modifiers, in addition to existing in the hometown area, may also exist on cards. We saw the tax collecting bonus. Here's a card that gives a player the persistent ability to always train one additional person when taking the philosopher action. So some require that you take the action and then the modifier applies. Here is one that's a virtual tile. Once during the heyday phase, a player can use this virtual tile. They would simply take a marker and mark that they've used it, so they don't have to put an action tile on their board. They still obviously have to pay the cost and they have to put a time token, but they could take this scribe action as normal. The normal modifiers apply. So whatever they paid modifies the strength of the action, and as we talked about, they've got to pay it. They can only do that once per heyday phase. We're going to cover all the different cards, so you're going to see the different types of modifiers and additional bonus actions that happen either in the heyday phase or even sometimes in the decline phase. Once a player has filled up all of their time slots, they're forced to pass, and so play will continue clockwise until all players have filled up their time track. At that point, that marks the end of the heyday phase and we'll move into the decline phase. The decline phase will start by first determining the new start player. So if a player took the start player, they would now receive the start player token. If a player protected it, it would stay with them. If nobody took this tile during the last heyday phase, the start player would remain the same. Next, each player is going to do a cleanup. They're going to clean up their time track, and they're going to remove wooden cubes from any hometowns and any cards that were played. So this player would return any cubes there. All of these cubes would get reset as part of the decline phase. This green player would remove all their cubes, and then now you would clean up your time track. So any of the action markers would simply get returned to the board, and then any of the single hourglasses would get returned to the supply. Double hourglasses will get flipped and remain on your board. So that was the penalty from taking a double hourglass in the prior round. It's now occupying my time track with a single hourglass, which will go away at the end of the next decline phase. Next, we'll advance the game turn marker and check for an era change. So if we're advancing within an era, nothing happens. The cards would stay the same. Remember, these get refilled immediately when someone takes them. If we were changing eras, going from 1 to 2, every player gets to remove a cube from their board. And the time markers can slide down. In addition, we're going to switch to the Era 2 cards. So all of the first era cards are going to get wiped from the board, along with any of the unused Era 1 cards, and this will now form the discard pile going forward. So now we have our discard pile, and now we're going to take the new Era deck and then deal out from it 8 cards into the selection tableau. All new replacement cards will now come from this deck. Next, players will get the chance to activate their cities and their civilization cards. Do this in the new turn order that was just established. In terms of activating cities, each player gets to activate one city in each region. So the white player, we can see, built a lot of cities, but all in one region. So they only get to activate one of these cities. It's their choice. They can decide to get a cube in their temple area, 5 coins from this trade house, a cube in their oracle, or 2 victory points. The green player has a city in 2 different regions, so they get to activate both. So they'll get a cube in their oracle area on their player board, and they'll get $5 from this trade house. If they had multiple, they'd have to choose which city in each of the regions to activate. After the cities are activated, in turn order, players can activate their civilization cards, any cards that have a decline phase action. So we can see, for example, this player would give 2 coins for every scholar this player has on their population track. So any decline cards indicated by the moon can be activated by the player at this time. This player has the option to get victory points. They can exchange 3 coins into 1 victory point, and they can do that up to 5 times. And the final step in the decline phase is to check the card limit. So you can have up to 3 cards without any penalty. For every additional card, the player has to add an hourglass to their time track immediately. So this player doesn't have any cards in their hand, so they're fine. This player has 3 cards and an additional card here, so they've got to add 1 hourglass immediately to their time track since they had 1 card over 3. Once you've finished all the steps of decline, you're ready now to start the heyday phase all over again. At the end of the 6th round, you're still going to go through the entire decline phase. So players will get one last chance to do all these things and then activate their cities and civilization cards one last time. After you've completed the decline phase for that final 6th round, you're going to do final scoring. So the first part of final scoring, if players have cards still remaining in their hand, they can either score them for half victory points if they meet the requirements, or they're going to get penalized half the victory points if they can't be fulfilled. And you're always going to round up. So for example, let's say this player has these 2 cards in their hand at the end of the game. This one, if we look at their population track, yes, they meet all the requirements for this, so they can score half the victory points rounded up. So they get half a point rounded up, so they'd get the full point for this card. This one we can see they can't fulfill. They don't have enough soldiers and other people. So they're going to lose half the victory points rounded up. Here is 6. So they'd lose 6 victory points. Also remember, any cards fulfilled only give you half of the victory points listed here. You do not trigger any of these icons, nor do you resolve any of these effects, nor does this card go into the tableau. You simply, if it can be fulfilled, earn half those victory points, and that's it. After you resolve remaining cards, players will receive an additional victory point for every 10 coins, and they'll receive 1 victory point for every 2 cubes they still have left on their Oracle and Temple track. So this player has 2 cubes on those tracks, so they can get an additional victory point. And then finally, players may earn penalties for remaining hourglasses in their tableau. So during that final 6th round, if a player had played a double hourglass, you'll remember during the decline phase, as part of cleanup, we'll flip it over and they'll stay on the player's board for each remaining hourglass at the end of the 6th round. They'll earn negative victory points. For 1, they'll lose 2. 2 remaining hourglasses, they'll lose 4. 3, lose 8. And if they have 4 plus remaining hourglasses, they'll lose 16 victory points. Most victory points wins the game. If there's a tie, you'll actually see which player actually was able to play the highest number of cards to their tableau. And if there's still a tie, the player with the highest amount of remaining coins wins the game. So finally, let's go over some of the different iconography and abilities you're going to find on the civilization cards. Alright, so let's go over all the different types of iconography you might see. You'll remember that the requirements to fulfill a card are in this lower left. This doesn't require any city requirements. You just have to have the required population or people trained. Here it doesn't have any additional advantages or disadvantages. You may have a card like this. This requires 2 oracle cities for the player. So for the purposes of meeting the requirement, the city can exist in an oracle spot in a region or in an oracle spot in a hometown. Both of those would count as meeting the requirement. So as long as you have 2 of them, hometowns and cities would fulfill that requirement if they were in oracle spots. Here it just requires you to have 1 of any. A temple city or temple hometown, oracle city or hometown, or a trade city or hometown. This one requires you to have 1 of each. Whenever you see this icon, this gives you a permanent training in that person. So immediately you can increase your population track in that category based on the icon. This requires you to permanently remove 1 of those. So here I would have to slide my nobles down 1, but I was able to increase my scholars by 1. It's important to remember you have to be able to accommodate the advantages or the disadvantages of the card in order to play it. So if your artisans were at your nobles here were at 0, you wouldn't be able to lose it. Most of the time it's asking you to permanently discard one of the ones that was required to meet the cards anyways. Conversely, if your scholar trek was already at 6, you couldn't accommodate the additional scholar, so you'd have to find a way to accommodate that. Anytime you see this cube with an arrow, this allows you to immediately discard one of the cubes on your time track, which can be immediately used for additional actions. This symbol allows you to immediately build a city, but you don't trigger any of the benefits. So this one you could build a city or a hometown in an oracle spot, a trade city or a trade hometown, and then here's a wild card. So you can build any type of city or any type of hometown. Just keep in mind none of the bonuses trigger. So whether it's a hometown or a region, nothing will trigger. It just gives you the right to simply place one of your cities on the matching spot. This icon means you always have a virtual worker in that type. So in this example, it's a priest. In this example, it always gives you a virtual artisan and a virtual scholar. So think of these as if you always had a cube to discard in your temple for the purposes of fulfilling the requirements on a card. You always have at least one, in this instance, available to you. These, however, would not count towards satisfying the requirement of getting 18 people trained for a bonus tile. This one gives you an available action during the heyday phase. So once per the heyday phase, as we talked about, you could put a cube here and you get the equivalent of a philosopher action with a cost 2 and 1 hourglass. So you always pay the cost and the time, but you don't have to put the marker, the action marker, on your player board. You simply mark this with a cube. You would have to put the time marker, though, on your player board. This works the same way, but it's for the scribe action. So it gives you that virtual tile that you can use. Put a cube there. You can use it once per heyday phase. There are some that give you persistent modifiers to these actions. So if you have this one, whenever you play a philosopher action, so you're taking one of the tiles off of the board, or maybe you're using this one, or maybe you're using a hometown benefit, you can always choose how much you pay between 1 and 8 coins. This is a persistent benefit for whenever the philosopher action is taken, you can train an additional person. This one will modify these types of actions. So whenever a scribe action is taken, you have the persistent power to pay anywhere between 1 and 10 coins, which, as we know, modifies the power of the ability. This is a persistent modifier to the tax collector action. So whenever that action is taken, you're able to take the amount of coins again. So if you take this one, you pay 1 hourglass, you can take 4, and if you had this, you could take an additional 4. So whatever amount of tax is collected, you get to take that amount a second time. And this can stack with multiple things in the game. So for each one of these you have, you get to collect that same amount of coins a second, a third, or a fourth time based on how many of these you have. Whenever you see the moon symbol, it means this happens during the decline phase. So when you activate this card during the decline phase, you would get 5 money. Here you would get 2 coins or 2 money for each scholar you have, so the matching person. Here would be 2 for each artisan, so whatever the matching person is, you would get 2 coins. Here are victory points for during the decline phase. So here the player would get 1 victory point for every city or hometown they have in play. Here they would get 3 victory points. And here they can actually convert coins into victory points. They could buy up to 5 victory points for 3 coins each. One other point on this one, let's say the player has actually already removed all of their cubes from the board, and then they play a card that allows them to remove another cube. They can actually take a cube and place it in either their oracle or their temple spot on the board, their player board. And there are going to be various combinations of all this iconography that we've just talked about, but that covers every type of icon you're going to see in the game and how it's used. So that should be everything you need to set up and play Gentes.